Hi, I'm Diana Phillip, Executive Director for NARAD Pro-Choice Maryland. Thank you for joining us with our very special guest, Delegate Eric Luedtke, for an Inside Scoop on the Maryland General Assembly for 2021. So we're trying to put together some webinars and ways to engage with people so they know more about what to expect with this very, very challenging session, I believe, in terms of people getting the information that they want, wondering what the process is going to be like, how long session's going to last. There's so many questions. And so this is a great opportunity for us to learn and be engaged. So today we have Eric with us, who's our House Majority Leader. And I thought that he might be a great person to ask about what's going on with session and how, what are the things that we should be looking for? What are the things that you think are going to be very interesting this session?
Thanks, Diana. Thanks for inviting me. And I'll talk a little bit about sort of what the session is going to look like, and then what I think are going to be some of the major topics of debate. And then I answer any questions that folks have. I think, like every part of our society, the legislature, particularly legislative leadership, have been spending the last 8 months trying to figure out how to run a legislative session that's transparent and accountable to the public, but also safe for members of the public, for members of the legislature, and for our staff. And so both the Maryland House and the Maryland Senate are going to be operating under very different procedures than we normally do, although in some ways we're going to be more transparent, frankly, than we've ever been in the history of the legislature. So the Senate and the House are going to run things a little bit differently. And in part, that's just because the Senate is a smaller body, right? 47 people in a room is easier to do safely than 141, which is what we have in the House. So in the Senate, the floor voting is going to continue much as normal. The president of the Senate's office has set up plexiglass partitions on the floor of the Maryland Senate. They look like little phone booths that they're using to separate the senators from each other. And they'll be within those partitions engaging in debate and discussion and maybe filibustering like they normally do in the Senate. They will, the floor session there and in the committee hearings will not be, my understanding is, open to the public in the same way that it normally would, but it will be streamed and people will be able to offer testimony remotely. In the House, we will likewise be running our committee hearings and voting sessions on Zoom. And in fact, in the past, we've broadcast our hearings on the internet through a webcast. We will be doing the same thing for the first time for all of our committee voting sessions, subcommittee working sessions, and subcommittee voting sessions. So for the first time, the public will be able to access pretty much all the work we do online and watch it while it's happening. Our hearings similarly will be conducted electronically. People will be able to sign up online. They'll be able to participate online and offer testimony on bills. In order to make sure that we don't have hearings that go on too long, they are capping the number of witnesses per bill at 50 witnesses. There's really only a handful of bills every year that are over that number normally, so I don't think it'll affect that many bills. In our floor sessions, because of the number of members we have, we're going to split up actually into two groups. Half of us are going to be on the floor of the House. Half of us are going to be in what we're calling the House Annex, which is really a couple big rooms in our office building. And we're going to be continuing to debate and vote, but just from two different locations. And that's to sort of, divide the group so that if there's an outbreak in one group, then the other group might be able to continue with some of the work of session. The House, for some additional safety, we're actually probably not going to have all of our members present for voting sessions after the first day until probably mid-February. So we'll be doing a lot of committee work, committee hearings, committee votes, but then floor voting probably won't take place till mid-February, by which time hopefully the vaccine distribution will be much further along than it is right now, and the virus will be under better control. So that, that's kind of the general outline. As Diana said, we're going to be playing it by ear to some extent, right? If there's a major outbreak in the legislative complex, there's a possibility that we take a break for a couple of weeks and then come back. There's always the possibility that we could end early, but I'd be surprised if that happened. I think it'll depend on whether anybody in the complex gets sick, but I think it's more likely than not that we'll be able to go through the entirety of session, depending, of course, on what's happening in the wider world. And so, as you might expect, in terms of the legislative agenda, the biggest item on our agenda is going to be COVID response. It's going to be dealing with, the impacts of COVID on Marylanders in a lot of different ways. There are certain industries which have been hit harder than others, which are going to have some specific focus. For example, the hospitality and restaurant industry, the childcare industry, you're going to see specific legislation focused on supporting those industries. You'll see legislation aimed at fixing the unemployment insurance system, which frankly in Maryland has been a mess. It's been incredibly frustrating. We've had tens of thousands of people that have had delays in getting access to their unemployment benefits, which should not happen. People are paying, companies are paying taxes so that their employees are covered when they get unemployed, right? That money should get to the people who need it quickly. So we'll be dealing with that. Number of healthcare related issues, continue to expand opportunities for telehealth. I think the ways that we've had to adapt to deal with COVID have also accelerated changes in a number of fields. And I think telehealth is one of those. I think telecommuting is one of those areas that we'll be seeing a lot of legislation on. And back to the hospitality industry, Maryland's for a couple decades now been undergoing a series of slow reforms to our alcoholic beverages laws that will be accelerated, I think, this year. And then the other sort of major area that I think there's going to be a lot of focus on, I would put under the aegis of racial equity. Obviously, since the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, there have been a lot of debates in state houses across the country about police accountability and how to ensure that all Marylanders have equal access to justice and are not being targeted unfairly. And so on the Senate side, there were a series of hearings, I think last summer, early bill hearings about some proposals related to police accountability. On the House side, we had a work group that the Speaker established, led by Delegate Vanessa Atterbury, who's the Vice Chair of the Judiciary Committee, that recommended a number of changes which now have the imprimatur of House leadership support, including repeal of a law called LEOBR, the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, which essentially sets up separate standards for accountability for police officers as opposed to other public employees. The implementation of a statutory statewide use of force doctrine, which would limit the use of certain types of force, such as chokeholds in certain situations, things like that. There's going to be conversation about Public Information Act access to police disciplinary records. And then, outside of police accountability, the Speaker, I think, is very aware in this moment of being the first woman and the first Black person ever to hold the office of Speaker. And so she has prioritized racial equity beyond criminal justice reform, and will be proposing a series of bills focused really on expanding economic opportunity for people of color in Maryland. Focused on the banking sector, expansion of minority and women-owned business opportunities, access to research dollars at universities, nailing down the settlement to provide funding for historically Black colleges and universities in the state, which have been historically underfunded by the state. So a range of proposals, really. And beyond that, of course, we have proposals every year that we don't even know are going to be proposals before session starts and become major topics of conversation during the 90 days. So there are things that are going to come out of left field that we'll end up debating. I think in general, I'm cautioning anybody who's advocating on anything in Annapolis to recognize that because we're operating under different rules than we normally do, the process may move more slowly. We may just simply get fewer bills done this year because we have to in order to do things safely. So, you know, we're going to work as hard as we possibly can, but that's an important caveat. So, with that, you know, Diana, anybody, I'm happy to take questions.
Well, I know that with the Senate limiting the number of bills that each senator can sponsor this year, if you do the math, it comes out to about 1,300, right? Like the 2,500 to 4,000 that we might see in another year. And I see that there's a bill that's been introduced to limit the number for the House as well. But it will be interesting to see, you know, how close we are to that 1,300, because I know that when I was running into legislators in public spaces, they would say things like, yeah, I'm just reintroducing what didn't go through last year, which is exactly what we're doing as well. But we also noticed that some of the bills that we had worked on, had they passed, they would have really helped during the COVID-19, you know, pandemic. And so we're very happy to reintroduce those bills. But I was also surprised to see some bills that I looked at, I'm like, really? This is the important thing that you want to do in this one session that we don't know how long it's going to be? So did you guys get pressure about, hey, make sure this is something that people actually want to hear? I mean, did you guys talk about that with all the House members?
On the House side, the conversations we had, we encouraged our members to sort of introduce fewer bills than they normally would. You know, there's a lot of factors that go into a member's decision-making about what bills they're going to introduce. And, you know, there's plenty of times where, you know, in order to stake out a political position or because a constituent requests it, a legislator will introduce a bill that really doesn't have a chance of passage, and they know that. And those are the kinds of bills that we kind of most encouraged people not to do this year. And, you know, some of our members, I think, paid more attention to that than others. But you know, I think, you know, I would be surprised if we didn't end up with fewer bills this year than we normally do. And we've been on a trajectory of a lot more pieces of legislation being introduced every year. I've been in the legislature 10 years now. We have a third more bills now than annually than we did when I first started. And, you know, that's pretty significant increase in that period of time. So maybe this will serve as a check on that. I think the Senate's issue was slightly different. When we talk about a House member introducing a lot of bills, we're talking like 20 bills. When we're talking about a Senate member, we've had Senate members that have introduced 60 or 70 bills. And honestly, there's no way to do your due diligence on that many bills during a 90-day session. So I think the chambers are in a different place there.
Diana?
Yeah, so I just wanted to jump in. I gather there's a disconnect between the timing on when the House and when the Senate are going to take up veto overrides. Can you talk about that a little bit? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. So because the House, what we're going to do is we're going to come in the first day, we're going to vote our rule changes, cycling people into the chamber and then kicking them out. So we don't have many people in the chamber at the time. And then we're going to send our members home for 3-4 weeks, right? And that's to try to, you know, get through the worst period of the pandemic before we start having people on the floor for floor votes. We would take up the veto overrides at that point. The Senate, you know, they're planning to be in on the floor the whole time as of right now. So, you know, there is the possibility that the Senate comes in, you know, January and does them the first week. And then we come back to at least the Senate sponsored overrides when we get back. Now, this gets into all sorts of procedural nuance.
Okay.
If the bill was a House bill, it has to start in the House. So,
right.
You know, it's just going to, but, you know, ultimately on the House side, at least we have the votes to override every single bill that was vetoed. So, you know, it's the Senate that's a little more dicey on some of the bills.
And what about, it seems to me the closest legislature and the closest setup has always
And you know, I don't know that there's actual, I haven't seen legislation yet being introduced to do that, but I think there's a lot of people that would be interested in that conversation.
Well, if it's any consolation or of any use, there's a lot of support out here. So not everybody would throw up their hands and say, you guys just want more money. And I think one of the selling points, honestly, would be the ability to say, we've taken care of a lot of ethical challenges. I mean, I've seen some, it has been explained to me how some elected members of that body seem to have incredibly driven agendas based on what they do during the other 9 months of the year. And it's both, you know, non-functional, but also deeply offensive. So, you know, I think there are lots of ways to get around the argument that you guys just want more money, or it's just going to cost more regardless of what you guys want. And I think there would be a lot of support for trying to push that. I'm not offering to advocate for a particular bill, but if you have conversations, let people know that there's actual support for it out here, not just from, I presume I'm not in the full category. Joan, you can check me on this, of the crazies. But there's solid support for.
I don't think you're in that category at all, Diana.
That puts us all in. But I seriously, I mean, there's just so much frustration with the fact that, you know, anyway, enough said. Thank you.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, we have a 19th century structure of government in a 21st century state. And that's one feature of that reality.
Hi, thanks for your time. This has been really helpful and informative. I just wondered if you could talk about that police bill of rights and what you think the chances are of reforming it, overturning it, getting rid of it, whatever the procedure is to, I mean, that's it's such an impediment to police reform, as you've pointed out. I just, if you could give a little recap on, or an update on how you think the change will be. Is there a lot of support for it? Do you think it will go through? Thank you.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. You know, on the House side, I think, you know, given the position of the work group, I'm pretty confident in saying that the House is ready to pass a full repeal of Leober. I think the question mark is the Senate. They didn't have a similar work group process, and their process operates very differently from ours generally. You know, I'm hopeful they'd have the votes to pass a full repeal. But, you know, I don't think anyone knows for sure right now whether that's going to happen on their side.
Does that come out of the judiciary on the Senate side?
Yeah, the Judicial Proceedings Committee.
So that would be Will, right?
Mm-hmm. And I know Will is dedicated to, you know, he wants to fully repeal. But the issue is whether he can find the votes on his committee, and then whether, you know, more importantly, whether they can find the votes on the House floor to repeal. And, you know, the Senate has a different challenge than we do in the House, because, you know, we tend to be more of almost a parliamentary style body in the House, honestly, when bills come to the floor. In the Senate, they have real floor debates, and they have a larger proportion of Republican and conservative members. So, you know, Leober, I think all of these police reforms, there's going to be substantial debate. And added to that is the fact that the Senate Republican caucus had a change in leadership during the interim. They essentially removed the leadership they had, which was a leadership that was maybe a little bit more moderate and willing to work with Democrats and Democratic leadership in the Senate. And, you know, they were replaced with a leadership that is very conservative. So the second ranking Republican in the Senate now is Mike Huff, who's, you know, was on the national board of ALEC, and, you know, yeah, he's very conservative and combative. So I think one of the open questions is what that looks like on the Senate floor.
Thanks. I didn't realize that about the Republican leadership. Well, that's not going to be good.
Yeah, there have been some real sort of internal fights within the Republican Party, particularly between the Trumpers and the Never Trumpers. And we saw a little bit of it on the House side, but it ended up, you know, kind of petering out. But we do have, I mean, we've got a House Republican member who was on the legal team for Donald Trump in Pennsylvania, and, you know, sued the state of Maryland, sued Larry Hogan for implementing a mask order, you know.
Is that Mark Fisher?
No, actually, it's Dan Cox. So, yeah, I think, one of the open questions about this session is how, given the turmoil of particularly the election, how some of these, extremely right-wing members react, and, do they try to disrupt things? How do they respond to the precautions we're taking around COVID? That's a big question mark.
Well, I had a shockingly productive conversation with Mark Fisher after he completely insulted my bill sponsor in his committee, Economic Matters. But
sounds about right.
Can you outline what the 3 or 4 categories are that each body has sort of serious bipartisan momentum? I mean, I have to believe COVID relief, but like what parts of COVID relief, or Kerwin, but what parts of Kerwin, or the environment, but what specific aspects of those are really just, I won't say non-controversial, but have a solid push behind them, bipartisan?
For the most part, I think the healthcare stuff, more than anything, is fairly bipartisan and both sides of the street. And part of that, Nick Kipke serves on the HTO. He's the Republican minority leader in the House. Part of it is just committee culture around healthcare issues. And a lot of them are issues that, aside from, frankly, issues of reproductive choice, a lot of them are issues where there isn't a lot of disagreement, right? I mean, should people have more access to telehealth? Sure, that's not a partisan issue, right? I think any economic things related to COVID that don't involve spending more money, you're going to find a lot of agreement on, right? So, lifting alcoholic beverage regulations, helping out restaurants, like you'll see a lot of sort of agreement on that stuff. Interestingly, one issue that may come up, the governor's been operating under emergency powers that were granted to him following 9/11. And this is the first time that any governor has used those emergency powers. And they've turned out to be extensive. And so there are a lot of folks that are concerned that the administration's been operating with limited oversight. So, there's been some conversations on the Democratic side about, well, let's make sure that we have adequate legislative oversight. And at the same time, a lot of my Republican colleagues don't much like Larry Hogan. So they're also interested in that kind of thing. But they're, I think, driven a little bit more by retribution than anything. And so, that'll be an odd bedfellows issue. On the racial equity stuff, I think you'll see some disagreements on some of the police reform issues, but there's a subgroup of the Republican Party that's very libertarian that may like some of the ideas in that. So we'll see.
Are you familiar with the proposals to fix the unemployment insurance system?
Not deeply familiar with them. That's not committee, so I don't know a whole lot of the details. It's Delegate Ned Carey and Chairman Davis are the two who've been kind of taking on that.
We're still getting slammed. We're handling thousands of cases for people now, and the Department of Labor is
impossible to deal with.
Yeah, they call them cases. They don't realize there's people underneath them who have been evicted and are living in their cars, and now their cars are being repossessed. It's as bad as it can be.
I mean, look, but it's the ideology of the conservative movement for the last 30 years has been reduce the size of government, and ultimately what you get is government agencies that don't have the staffing or expertise to handle situations like this. And I think what we've seen at the Department of Labor is a perfect example. Throughout the pandemic, they've had to hire out more and more and more people because they just didn't have the staff. And I think it's been particularly egregious in unemployment insurance, but I don't think I can name a single state agency where that is not an issue. Every agency I deal with is understaffed. Every single one is losing people to the private sector constantly because we underpay. So.
Delegate, I was wondering if you could talk about COVID-related response legislation around education, if there's anything on the horizon.
Yeah, so you know, we thought we'd be done with Kerwin, but the governor vetoed the blueprint, the Kerwin bill, and the school construction bill that was tied to it. So, you know, we're going to be overriding those vetoes, but then we're also hopefully going to be making some changes in them to front load the reforms. There are actually reforms already in Kerwin that are kind of tailor-made for responding to the moment in terms of education. In particular, the biggest challenge from my perspective is that we have a group of students that includes some portion of our ESOL population, our special ed population, our low income population, and our rural population that for various reasons has basically not had access to education. And even if they have had access, I taught for 11 years as a middle school teacher. It is not the same thing. I got 4 kids. I can tell you it is not the same thing. So we will have students that have fallen behind. And, you know, the research tells us the single best way to intervene with students who need that kind of individualized assistance is individualized tutoring. So the Kerwin bill had a program in it called Transitional Supplemental Instruction, which was individualized tutoring. And it's actually already being implemented. We started it under the bill we passed in 2019 that we called Bridge to Kerwin. So it would, as the idea behind it is that knowing that we have groups of students who are not being educated the way they should be, that as the state was ramping up the additional money to school systems that would help improve education generally, we would provide this individualized instruction to help those students in the meantime. And it would ramp up over the course of 3 years, I think, to a max of like 75 million. I've been pitching, and I think House leadership's on board, and we're working on the Senate, that we should implement that immediately, max it out as soon as possible. And interestingly, the amount of money that we would max out at in transitional supplemental instruction is almost exactly the amount of money that we would get if we overrode the governor's veto of the tobacco tax increase. So, you know, we have a way to pay for it. You know, on top of that, there are a lot of issues that have been exposed around broadband access and internet access and device access, both in schools and outside of schools. And, you know, to their credit, the school systems have done a tremendous job stepping up and providing, you know, at first out of their own budget and then with some federal and state assistance, additional devices to students, hotspots to students, which have made that access more possible for more students. The latest COVID stimulus bill passed by the Congress includes additional money for broadband, which will help with that as well. You know, so I think a year from now, we're going to be in a very different place than we were going into the COVID pandemic in terms of access to the internet. In a broader sense, I think folks down here are convinced that we should be treating high-speed internet access like we treat access to electricity and water as a basic utility that everyone needs access to. I think we'll have to get there in a different way because the federal government has limited what states are able to do on issues related to the internet and broadband in some ways that we can't do what we did at a state level, and we can't make broadband a regulated utility like electricity is. But we're going to find different ways to approach it.
Hi, Paula again. About provisions for food insecurity. I mean, it's a big problem for children who get meals in schools, but I live half a block from a school, which is a food distribution center. And I can just tell you, I'm sure what everybody on this call knows, that the fact that the lines are that long, United States of America in Montgomery County is devastating. So is there anything going to happen to help that situation?
Yeah, there will be. On the plus side, I think the DHR, which the Department of Human Resources, which runs the food stamp program and a number of other economic benefits programs, has done much better than the Department of Labor. Now that's a very low bar, but they've done better, at least from what I've seen with my constituents, in getting folks access to food support, nutritional support. So, you know, I hope that continues. I think the school systems are going to continue providing food to people through their programs. I think you're going to see conversations down here about expanding benefits and expanding access. My colleague in my legislative district, Delegate Pam Queen, has been working in particular in summer food access. Continue to get a lot of kids who, you know, they get free and reduced price meals during the school year at school, but when the schools close, access is a lot harder. And so, you know, there's now a small additional food stamp benefit for families with children over the summer, which is a result of legislation that she passed. So I know she's working on related legislation to try to expand access to that benefit. You know, I think though, you know, it's all interconnected, right? A lot of the people that are, you know, desperate for nutrition support are also desperate for their unemployment benefits that they're not getting. And that's part of the reason they're in line. And so, you know, we got a bunch of these pieces that we need to fix, focused on making sure families can get by.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And seeing that we just got through an election year, are there any kind of voting rights bills that you're aware of?
Yeah, there's a bunch of them. You know, in terms of what I think really has a good shot at passing, we're going to have a bill to further expand access to early voting, increasing the number of sites in counties, because we got some counties, I mean, fairly large populations like St. Mary's County that only have one early voting site. So if you want to vote early in St. Mary's County and you live down near Point Lookout, it takes you more than an hour to drive to your polling place. That doesn't make sense. So expanding early voting, connecting the early voting period with the regular voting period like we did this year, which we should have done a long time ago, making the ballot drop boxes permanent, giving people the ability to fill out, get what's called a permanent absentee ballot or permanent mail-in ballot, where instead of having to sign up every election to get a mail-in ballot, you can just sign a form once and you will permanently get sent a mail-in ballot. As long as you're a registered voter. Yeah, I'm bringing back a bill called the Student and Military Voter Empowerment Act that's focused on sort of populations that have difficulty accessing the voting process, in particular, college students, active duty military, particularly overseas active duty military, and senior facilities. And there's a bunch of provisions to it, but bottom line is it's designed to sort of take down some barriers. And in the case of students, to require universities to be a lot more proactive in helping their students understand how to exercise their right to vote.
Who do you see? Who do you see opposing that? And do they have enough traction to actually get in the way? And also, specifically the White Oak issue that came up last cycle. Sorry, that's my heater. The White Oak issue that came up last cycle in terms of getting an early voting site there that our county board of elections shot down. Would that be addressed by what you're talking about here?
Yeah, right now, Montgomery County is entitled to 11 plus 1 early voting sites, I think. We're mandated to have 11. We're allowed to have one additional one. That was a result of a bill of mine, actually. But the County Board of Elections, as you know, decided not to authorize that 12th site, to my immense frustration, because it was, you know, frankly, I'm going to be blunt, it was driven by race and partisan politics. Right. White Oak is a lower income community of color.
Very low car ownership rate. And
right.
I mean, the Board of Elections discussion was this close to saying exactly what you said in its own words. I mean, yeah. one of the members said, if those people can't get their act together to ride 2 buses and wait in a 4-hour line, they shouldn't vote. Yeah.
I mean, the short answer is yes. So the early voting legislation, I think in the case of Montgomery County and Baltimore City and Prince George, as the largest counties, will increase the number of sites from 11 to 13, mandated sites. So, you know, does that guarantee that there's a site at White Oak? Not necessarily, but it it makes that much more certain than it was before. And I think it would be hard for the Board of Elections not to do it. I've also been pushing for a change in how we appoint members of the boards of elections, the local boards of elections. The rule, which goes back to, the machine politics era, the winner take all era of, the spoil system, right? The rule is that whoever holds the governorship gets a majority of every local board of elections. And that's stupid. It's stupid in Montgomery County, which is or Baltimore City, which are incredibly blue jurisdictions that right now have Republican majorities of their boards of elections. And it's stupid in Garrett County, which, as far as I know, has never voted for a Democrat for governor or president, and when there's a Democratic governor, has to have a Democratic majority on their board of elections. It's dumb. So, I've been pushing for the idea that it should be driven by the vote in the individual county, which I think would resolve some of these issues. But, we'll see. That's one of those ideas that's kind of on the bubble this session. I don't know if it's going to get through, but fingers crossed.
So speaking, I don't know if everybody here is from Montgomery County, but for the Women's Democratic Club, we would be happy to support that from this corner of the world.
Cool.
That's a big one for us.
Yeah.
So we've got just a few minutes left, and just wanted to see if the delegate has any kind of closing remarks, or if anybody has one last burning question. I know that for us as an advocacy organization, this is going to be very challenging to go into session and try to provide the information that some of our legislators that we think need in trying to assess whether or not to support a bill or defeat it. And that's why I was kind of hoping there would be hardly any controversial bills this session, because we're going to be so remote. And I was saying to all our interns who we were interviewing for this session, I'm so sorry I can't take you to Annapolis. You're not going to be able to be with me in the hallway outside a bathroom stalking a legislator asking for a vote, which is some of the sexy part of lobbying, and is all going to be this Zoom kind of virtual texting, trying to get people's attention, but not being able to really talk about and finesse some of the language, especially when people are putting together amendments that it really scares me. It actually really does. And I'm really hopeful that the controversial stuff that comes up, if anybody's thinking of putting something in that needs a lot of work, we'll just introduce it. It's an educable moment. And then next session, let's take a look at it, because I think this is the session about COVID-19. This is the session about getting people the relief that they need. And that's what my hope is as an advocate.
Yeah, I think it'll depend on the committee in question, whether they're trying to, I think that'll be subject to a lot of factors, but I would suspect that in general, we will not be taking on as many controversial bills. And frankly, on a lot of the stuff that's super controversial and that would normally take up time, we've intentionally been doing the work before session, right? The police accountability work group, we have, I think at least on the House side, a proposal for sports betting, so we've been trying to deal with some of the more difficult issues. In terms of access, we've been very clear with our members in encouraging them to make themselves as available as possible. The House building, at least as of right now, will still be physically accessible for meetings. You won't be able to hang out in the hallway, but you will be able to make an appointment, come into the building, and then the staff member of a particular legislator will escort you to their office. So their in-person meetings as of right now will still be allowed on the House side, but a lot of our members are setting up virtual office hours, trying to make themselves as available as possible to as many people as possible. But it is certainly very different from a normal session. And I think I've heard universally from advocates on every type of issue, angst and concern about that. If there are processes, things that are being done that you feel like aren't providing as much access as you need, please let us know, because we're trying to make sure that our members are being responsive and that the public does have the ability to offer the input that they need to.
Thank you. I appreciate that. All right, folks, it's 12:45. I want to be mindful of everyone's time. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Delegate Eric Luedtke, for your insight and the really good questions, folks. Really appreciate it. And I'll send out the recording.
Thank you.
Good
Thanks
one.
for this. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. See ya.
Thank you.
Happy New Year.
Happy